Hello, I'm Jonathan Chevalier, and I'd like to welcome you back to this week's Charity Digital News webinar. I'm delighted to welcome back today Teresa Litzer of Lightful for the third in our series on social media. In January, we explored content planning with our Content 101 session, and in March, we looked at social media best practice for charities. All those sessions, together with others we have done on things like digital leadership, Microsoft skills, and cyber security are all available now on our website as well, if you missed them at the time. If you joined us before, it's really great to have you back, and if it's your first webinar with us, I hope it's the first of many. Today with Teresa, we've got a speaker who's highly experienced, both as a writer, blogger, and social media expert, and her role at Lightful is as social media and training manager. And we're going to be exploring the whole area of personalisation, which I think is a fascinating development within the field of social media. In terms of us, Charity Digital News, we're run by Tech Trust. So we're a charity that is focused on helping other charities to maximise their impact through their use of digital technology. And we run these webinars with the simple aim of raising the digital skill levels across the sector. And we cover a really diverse range of topics. So I mentioned before the recordings we've got on digital leadership, cyber security, we've also done collaboration, we'll be doing fundraising later in the year, as well as obviously social media today. And we choose this time to run them, typically a Thursday lunchtime, because we think that's the time that's most convenient for people overall. The programme is designed so you can pick and choose the sessions as you want, so you can just drop into those that are of interest to you. In terms of what's coming up, we're taking a break for the next couple of weeks, but we're going to be back in June, where we've got sessions on areas such as mobility solutions, the cloud, and maybe a somewhat more unusual session, because we're going to be looking, well, it's in the area of GDPR, but we're actually going to be looking at GDPR and staff records, which is actually a pretty key area, and one that all of us who employ staff actually have a responsibility to adhere to. So that will be a really interesting session as well. In terms of other things we do, well, Charity Digital News carries a range of content, so as well as webinars. We have a lot of video content, some of that from our recent conference, and a whole lot of written articles and guides on a whole range of topics. We also run TT Exchange, which provides access to donated and discounted technology from major technology companies. We run TT Mail, which is a white labeled email service based on the .mailer platform. So if maybe you get a little bit frustrated from time to time with the limitations of MailChimp, you'd really love this service. And then Charity Digital Jobs, which, as it sounds, is a jobs portal. In terms of today's webinar, we use a Zoom platform because we think it's the most stable overall. We're not anticipating any technical issues today, but if there should be any, then do please just stay online, refresh, and it should come straight back on. In terms of questions, you can log them at any point during the session. So there's a button at the bottom of the screen, a Q&A button. Just click on that and answer your question. And then we'll be answering all of those at the end. Also, your feedback is really, really important to us as we use it both to choose future webinars we should be doing, so shape our direction of our program, and also to let us know how we're doing overall. So we'd really appreciate it if you could fill in the feedback form, which will be sent at the end of the session. It's a very simple form with only a few questions, and it should take less than 2 minutes to complete. So do please do that. So that's really all I wanted to say by way of introduction. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Teresa.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's good to talk to some of you again, in case you joined the previous webinars. In case you haven't, we're working with Charity Digital News on a series of webinars around social media. And today we'll talk about social media and personalization. This will be an introduction on what do we mean by personalization when it comes to social media, and how does that really translate when it comes to the audience, the objectives, and of course the content. How can you personalize your content? Looking at some examples And we're always open to hear your questions and get into more ideas of what we can cover throughout the session. So when we're talking about social media and personalization, it has been something that's been covered for quite a while, but it can have many different layers. So sometimes it can be confusing. In very simple terms, when we're talking about personalization, it's an effort to try to understand more your audience and your supporters in your social media channels so that you start building a connection with them through more relevant and targeted messages. So pretty much with personalization in social media, you can have a rich experience so that you build a journey with your supporters to try to help them find out more relevant information about your organization. So when we're talking about personalization, this is just a very basic example, what it's like posting without personalization. You do have the message that you're posting on your social media channels, and it's a bit general because you want to make sure that you do reach all your followers. This is still a good approach because you're trying to be general so that it makes sense for everyone. But the problem is that sometimes it can be way too general because most organizations are not really having one person as the target audience in mind. So what is relevant for someone might not be for someone else. So that can also bring the problem of having a lack of engagement because not everyone finds your content interesting. And then someone might feel that this is not really what they were expecting. So it gets a bit harder to measure the success in that case. So when we're talking about personalization, it's the effort to try to split your content on social media, being more specific and narrowing it down for your audience. So for example, if you want to reach your potential supporters, that's a different messaging than reaching your volunteers or reaching your trustees with your content. So you want to start thinking, does that content make sense to be posted on every single channel? Do I want to focus on every channel in different kind of content so that I try to be more relevant? And just to make it simpler in terms of the approach, you start thinking of the audience first, and then you're going through a journey, thinking of the message and of course the right channels, so that you keep in mind all your data and what your supporters really want from you, and trying to align that with the objectives. And we'll explain all of them one by one now. So before getting into that, just have a think, what do we want to get out of personalization? There are many different ways to benefit from personalization. The most important thing is that you start understanding your supporters and you're finding out more about what they expect from you. It's not really enough sometimes to just post the content because you think that it might work for them, but we tend to get into many assumptions about what's working, and it's always useful to look at the data and understand our supporters. And once we start with personalization, we also tend to see an increased engagement because our supporters feel that this makes more sense for what is really relevant for them and what matters. And that, of course, is translated into social media success. And no matter what your objectives are, you tend to see improved results. And at the bigger level, it's also helpful with the human connection because social media is all about being social. So you don't just want to focus on the metrics. Sometimes you want to make sure that you do build trust with your supporters so that you build a longer term relationship, whether that's translated into fundraising or just general support. So we start with the audience. It's probably the most important thing when talking about personalization so that we understand how to make the most of it and how to understand our supporters. When it comes to demographics, personalization can help us really understand who our actual demographics are, because again, we tend to have some assumptions. We think, for example, that Facebook is not necessarily for younger people, but once we actually look at the stats, we might realize that our Facebook page actually has many young supporters. So it's always useful to have a look at the current demographics and what who your supporters are. So when it comes to the audience analysis, it's useful to compare that on every social media channel. You can have a look at Facebook directly on Facebook Insights. You see the screenshot here attached that You can understand who your supporters are, whether the gender makes any difference, the country, or even the language sometimes. So this can help you shape up your content and try to think, how can I make it more relevant for them? When it comes to the other channels, you can also look at Twitter for the analytics, or you can also have a look at Google Analytics so that you can compare your social media audience and those who actually visit your site. So all of them can offer interesting insights, and you don't necessarily need to dive into detail, but it's still useful before deciding on the content that you want to share. The next step when we're talking about the audience and personalization is the process of building out personas. The personas are fictional characters that can represent your target audience. So for example, if you have different people in mind as your target audience, you might have service users, prospect donors, volunteers, or even your board and your trustees. All of them are really important, but they don't represent one person as your target audience. So it's quite a useful exercise, and this is an example from a charity we've worked in the past. They're called Wheels of Wellbeing. They wanted to understand their social media audience and how they can create more relevant content. So they went through the process of looking at the demographics. They created that fictional persona, their name, their organization they're working, what they're interested in, where do they spend the time on social media, and what motivates them when it comes to fundraising and building a connection. So this is a very useful process when you have to get into understanding your audience, and it's definitely something that you might find very useful. What's useful to remember when we're talking about audience and personas, of course, is that different channels can have different people actually checking out your content. So just because someone is following you on Facebook doesn't mean that they necessarily follow you on Twitter or on Instagram. So that gets into another challenge of thinking of your content based on the channel and not just your personas. So when you're trying to think of the content, try to have a look again at the demographics and how is that different from one channel to another, so that you try to be more relevant from them. Once you get into the personas and you understand more of your audience, you want to make sure that what you're creating on social media makes sense based on your general objectives. A good way to be more efficient on social media and not just feel that you're wasting your time because you're not really sure what's working is to set down smart objectives. These are pretty much clear and actionable goals that can help you throughout the process of creating content. So for example, instead of saying, I'd like to improve my social media presence, which is quite general, you might be more specific. You might want to set a goal. I want to increase my Twitter followers over the next 6 months. So I'll try to create more content and try to be more engaging with my supporters. So that's a different approach because you start being more practical and more actionable. And it can be very useful with personalization because when you're thinking of the goals, you start realizing that you can be more strategic with your social media presence. And of course, we know that it's kind of hard sometimes to find the time to use your social media platforms, especially if it's not the only thing that you're doing in your organization. So if you start thinking of being more productive and efficient with your time, it's useful to set down the goals that will help you make the most of your time while also being more successful. And the most important thing along with the audience is thinking of the actual content. How can you make sure that you actually start personalize that so that it's more relevant for your supporters? This is just an example. You start thinking of the main content that you have in mind. You might want to talk about the fundraising campaign. So then you think of the different people that you want to reach and what's really relevant for them. So your trustee might have a completely different idea in mind than your volunteer or your donor. They might still enjoy all the other posts, but they want to focus on more specific things. So if we have to provide an example, You might want to run a fundraising campaign to raise funds for your animal charity. So that's the main messaging. But then you start thinking, I want to make sure that the content resonates for the trustee, for the donor, and the volunteer. So you want to narrow it down. For example, the trustee might want to learn about the impact and the process, how you went through the fundraising campaign and what it actually worked. The donor might want to be even more practical. What does success look like and what's the call to action? How can they support you and how can they feel that they're really making a change with their contribution? And the volunteer might not necessarily be the similar case with the donor. So you want to make sure that you do focus on engagement to share ideas of how they can support you and how they can spread the message throughout the campaign. So as you can see, it's usually good to start with the main message, what you want to spread across from your social channels, and start thinking of the people that you want to target and what makes more sense to them. And just to dive even deeper into the idea of personalizing your content, this is the donor of the personas that we mentioned, and you want to share what success look like. The next step is that you want to think, where is that persona, the target audience, really spending most of the time? If we've noticed that they're more engaging on Facebook and Instagram, then these are the channels that you want to send the content. If you feel that Twitter is not really working, then you don't necessarily need to post the same content on every single platform. So think again of the main messaging, find the audience and where they spend the most of the time, and create more relevant content so that you make the most of personalization. A good way to start organizing all the different ideas and the content before feeling lost among all the posts is to start adding tags to your content. This is just an example, what I'm usually doing when I'm using the Lightful platform. When I want to share blog posts, for example, that are more relevant to those working in charity comms, I do create a tag named blog. But if you want to focus on a case study, or if you want to run a specific campaign, then you assign the tags for these specific posts, because it makes it way easier to look back afterwards and see what's really working. This can also be helpful to understand the types of posts that are more engaging. And it can also help you to find the most engaging personas, those who engage the most with your audience. And another way to make the most of social media, but also the other aspects of your campaigns when it comes to bringing the site and social media together. If you want to reach different personas, for example, it might be a fundraising campaign, or you might want to make sure that you're not confusing people with your messaging. You might want to create different landing pages on your site and use the different links in your social media posts. You can change the messaging if it doesn't resonate with them. You can change the creatives, the images, or if you have a video. And you can even try to target in a different way one persona over another. So as an example, we created an ebook last month for Lightful. It was around content planning, but we're targeting at the same time both those who work in UK charities, but also in the US. So as you can imagine, when talking about charities, the Americans prefer the term nonprofits. So a quick way to get with that issue is to create two different landing pages. So when we're creating ads or messages on social media, we use the two different landing pages just to make sure that we don't confuse people and everyone finds it relevant. And the last step when it comes to content and personalization is to find out what's really working. You can use Google Analytics just to see the performance of your channel beyond the social media success. And a good way is to track your links so that you can find what's really working from one persona to another. There are many online tools that you can just track your links. You just add the link and it's able to track those who clicked on the site. You can tell, for example, that if I'm creating a link for my donors, I had, for example, 50 clicks, but when I created a post around volunteers, then that had the higher impact and it had, for example, double the number of clicks. So in this case, it's useful because you start understanding what works. You can find out your most engaging personas. And you're also able to translate that into numbers in case someone wants to actually see the impact of your social media performance. And just going away from the theory to get more practical, to see at some specific examples of what do we mean by personalization. It's good to remember that personalization doesn't have to be really complicated. And even though all we discussed before what might have been very theoretical, sometimes it's just useful to look at the examples because you realize that it's not really hard. We just need to think more of our supporters. So as you can see in these examples, for example, Alzheimer's Society, they just shared a post that was about the power of music and singing. So someone who is specifically interested in that, or they have been involved in the specific post, they do find that it's relevant. Of course, it doesn't mean that everyone should necessarily engage with that, but it's the process of mixing your content so that you make sure that you can be more relevant to specific people. Or as you can see in the example from Crisis UK, they're creating a post mentioning very clearly, if you have experienced homelessness as a result of domestic abuse, share your story. So that is very specific because they want to target a specific audience. And it's a great way to show that you don't just create general content, but you try to be more specific and understanding for your audience. This was a really great campaign from Breast Cancer Now. It was, I think it was 2017. So they wanted to make sure that they thank everyone who's joining the campaign, whether it's just spreading the message or making a contribution. So that was the Wear It Pink campaign, and everyone who joined received the personalized video thanking them for the support. So obviously that means you need more resources in terms of the creative aspect in order to have these videos and send them around. But you could also do that just by sending a personalized reply, even without an image or a video, so that you make sure that people appreciate the support and that they do feel valued because they see that their name is part of this reply and it's not just a general reply. And another way to think of personalization and also to save time with your content is to try to involve your supporters more into your content planning on social media. So instead of just having yourself and your team wondering what to post, it can be useful to encourage your supporters to join your campaign, share their story, and then to repost the content. It's a great way to be more relevant because you know exactly what they want and how you can inspire them. And it also tends to be more engaging. And you do save time because you also find new content. So it can be useful in many ways. And something that's been trending, especially the last year, is the personalization through chatbots. That's of course a different process. It might not be relevant for all organizations, but it's really interesting because chatbots might be just automated replies when you go, for example, to Facebook Messenger, but they can be personalized because you start thinking of the content and someone who chats with them has different options based on what they have in mind. So as you can see the examples, this is from Shelter Scotland and the second one is from WaterAid. They wanted to make sure that they interact with their supporters in a more personalized level. And the second one was about a campaign that they wanted to share more details in a way that it gives you an idea directly from someone who's involved in the case. So it's really useful because you don't necessarily spend more time throughout the campaign, but you're still able to make the supporters feel special and just to play around and ask different questions just to see how it's working. And just an overview of everything we've discussed. This was again the introduction to personalization. There are so many ways to dive deeper and get the most of your data. But the starting point is about understanding your audience. You want to make sure before you start personalizing your content that you do understand your supporters, where they spend most of their time on the channels and how can you narrow it down when it comes to creating content. And then you want to start thinking of the objectives. What do you want to get out of each channel, and how can your content be more relevant but also more effective for the objectives you have in mind? And then it's the time to actually create the content, to start thinking of new ideas and to try to be more relevant without necessarily spending more time. For example, you've seen the idea of involving your supporters, of creating content based on specific channels. So it goes more on the quality rather than the quantity sometimes. And in case you want, again, Jonathan, of course, will share in the follow-up. If you want to start thinking, how can I plan my content, but making sure that, for example, the idea of the tags or just creating different posts for different audiences, I'm happy to help if you need anything with the Lightful platform. And it's time to hear all your questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Teresa.
Welcome.
I thought there's some really good practical tips there about, it sounds like a really complex, very consuming activity to personalize, and you get some really practical examples, such as the crisis example and user-generated content about how you can actually, I guess, personalize and bring your campaigns more to life. So that was great. But let's just a reminder, we've got some questions already, and we've got plenty of time to address them. If you want to raise a question, just click on the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, type it in, and then we'll work through them in order. So I've got one here from Rihanna, who's asking about personas. And do you build personas based only on the demographics of existing followers, or also the ones you don't have data on, but who you'd like to reach?
That's a really great question. You can create it both ways. You can start with the existing supporters and the demographics, which is the starting point, because once you create content, you want to make sure that it makes sense for them. But you might also, as you've said, have the ideal personas in mind, a different kind of audience that you haven't targeted them. So you could create different personas and start thinking, how can I create content that makes sense for either cases? So personalization in that case can be really useful.
And Anna's creating a new website. So she wants to know, are there any personalization do's and don'ts in terms of building that new website?
Great question. I think the idea of the landing pages can be useful because the homepage, for example, has to be general. Anyone who visits your site has to understand what you're working on and how they can find out more details. But you can play around with the idea of having a quick way to create landing pages. So it doesn't have to be very complicated and getting lost into the codes. There are many ways to just create similar pages, just changing the content, for example, and you're just making the most this way of personalization in quite simple way.
And another question, this is one's from Gemma, who's asking, what platforms can you use to generate personalized thank you videos? So obviously there was the example from breast cancer
So,
now, I think it was in the presentation. Yes.
So I haven't been involved in that campaign. I'm not really sure what the process that they've used. I think it has to do with some online tools that you just send the content automatically when someone responds to you. I think there's a tool called IFTT. So you just track some sort of recipes and you say, if someone responds to me, make sure you send this content. So I assume in that case on their side, there was also a lot of work to create different videos and making sure that they are automated, but you also have some sort of manual process to make sure that everything is working. But it's also interesting because you don't necessarily need to go through the whole process like what they did, which was obviously really great. You can just spend more time on replying to the mentions that you're getting, or to create an image that it's still general, but you're still having a personalized reply. So it's more about making them feel valuable, really, on the support and making it more personal than just a general thank you.
We've actually had some direct experience here.
Oh, really? Great.
With the videos ourselves, and there's a company called AdGreets.
Oh, great.
Who do this to kind of make it really easy.
Perfect.
So they generate the video, fields in the video to suck it out of the data.
You just
file.
add the names.
So then it combines them, and you can have different variations for the different personas as well. So it's really neat, actually. So that could be of help as well, Gemma. In terms, another one from Kai. Once you've decided how to change the message or campaign based on the audience or platform, what tools would you recommend for scheduling social media posts?
So I think I'm quite biased on that. I have to mention Lightful. We have a social media platform for charities, but of course there are many options out there. If you need any help from us, I'm happy to have a chat if you want.
So people should kind of get in touch with you.
I had to mention that, yeah.
Directly.
It's Teresa@lightful.com if you need a demo or have a look.
Yeah. And they're launching Giving by Text. Do you have any tips for personalisation around that?
I think it goes again to the idea, like the example of breast cancer care. It's usually when you want to thank your supporters that most cases of personalization exist, because you want to make sure that your message resonates with everyone, but you can play around, for example, with thanking them afterwards and be a bit more casual in that case, because you want to show that we do have that human connection. We want to make sure that you really appreciate everything we've done and your own contribution, actually.
And in terms of, you mentioned chatbots.
Yeah.
So I guess that's quite an interesting area overall, because they're not very much implemented yet in charities, but
and it can be tricky.
I was trying to talk to my broadband provider over a chatbot the other day, and it was a somewhat frustrating experience. And it kind of becomes pretty clear straight away that it's not really very intelligent and personalised in its response. So how do you see that kind of actually being able to work practically in a
I think it's interesting because it's this year discussed quite a lot around artificial intelligence and chatbots and how can they help us save time. For example, instead of talking to every single person when they're asking the same questions, you're just having a chatbot to answer the first level of questions. But that again needs your contribution in terms of thinking of the right questions. Because we've seen there are many chatbots even beyond the charity sector. They just want to say, I do have a chatbot, and it can end really bad because people start playing around, they see the wrong messages, and your brand is just affected because you end up in the exact opposite stage of what you wanted to get. So I think it's more again on creating the right content. There are so many things you need to consider with chatbots on the different levels of interaction. It's not just the main question, but if someone keeps asking you things, you want to make sure that you're still providing the right experience. Or even the messaging has to reflect your organization. You need to make sure that it has the right tone of voice. So there is a lot of thinking process in that. It can be useful, but yes, there's a lot of content.
Yeah, my broadband experience, they were using it to try and channel me to the right area, but I was an existing customer, which meant the time I was calling out, they didn't want to talk to me. It's kind of like they channel me away and say, no, we're too busy. Whereas clearly, if I was a new customer, they were going to talk to me. And I think that's a bad example of how you implement them.
There are lots of them.
I've seen some really great ones in the area of things like housing advice. That people can ask, very specific questions about legislation and their rights, and it channels them through to that information in the right way. Anyway, we've got a question here from Brogan. Most social media content Brogan uses is scheduled. How do you find the best days and times to get the most engagement? And I guess this might vary by, because we're talking about personalisation, this might vary by audience.
That's exactly relevant, yes. I don't think there is a secret recipe in terms of telling you, for example, Tuesday is better than Wednesday. But I think, again, you can go back to demographics. Facebook, for example, is telling you the most engaging days for your content. So you can have a look and see that, for example, Monday afternoon is better than Tuesday morning. So you start seeing where are the most interactions and how can I make sure that I do post at the right times. It also depends on the channel. For example, on Twitter, they say you'd better post in the commute times because everyone is using Twitter on their phones, so they have more chances to actually see your content. Yeah. So it's really test and learn sometimes how it works on every platform.
And We have a question here. What do you think about having the Twitter feed reflected on the landing or front page of the website? Obviously, quite a lot of people
Good
do
point,
that.
yeah.
Do you like that as an approach? Or?
I do like that. The only problem is that you want to make sure that you kind of monitor your Twitter feed and you pay more attention because you might retweet something that you don't want to show up on your site.
Yeah.
But if you are paying even a bit of attention, it's a great way to bring your people to your Twitter feed and just connect your site and your social media presence.
And a question going back to personas. That's a good question, actually. How many personas should we be looking to create?
Good question. It depends on the time that you want to process and how much you want to get out of it. You could even have 1 or 2 personas, but I've seen examples from charities who went into like 5 or 10 personas. That of course requires a lot of time and thinking, but it can be useful in the longer term. You just want to make sure that you don't get lost in the process and just forget who the personas are.
Yes.
So maybe like a balance between 1 or 2, or like having too many at some point.
And I guess to an extent, that's therefore going to be driven by the nature of the organisation. You know, if you're quite a diversified charity, which has got different beneficiary groups and maybe therefore also different donation groups. Yeah.
You have to have different
You're going to
ones,
need more. Yeah. Whereas if you're much more homogenous in what you're doing, then you can probably boil it down to a smaller number. Okay, we look like we've just about gone through all of the questions. I'll just give a few seconds, see whether there are any last ones coming through.
Still here.
Just while we're waiting to see if anything comes up. What's your, I guess it's, you know, if people are going to do one thing in the area of personalisation, what would you say that one thing should be?
I really like the process of understanding your audience, because it can be easy to just schedule more content and try to play around, but we don't really spend time, and myself included, to look at those who actually follow us on social media. We tend to assume that, oh yes, Facebook, for example, is having this kind of audience, Instagram might be for younger people, but it's not really the case sometimes. We just tend to assume and create the content. So it's useful from time to time to see those who actually follow you, the demographics. Is this the right audience? Is the content make sense for them? It's always a good process.
Yeah, good tip. We've got another question come through from Brogan. What tips do you have for grabbing your audience's attention? So images or videos, for example, or do you have any other hot tips here?
I think images and videos are definitely engaging on social media. The challenge is sometimes grabbing their attention really fast. For example, on videos, Facebook is suggesting you try to grab someone's attention in the very first seconds, because if the most interesting part is at the 5th minute, then chances are they probably won't see that. So try to think as someone who just checks social accounts, and before creating the content, what would grab your attention? It might be a very clever image. It might be just a meme that's really funny. So it's trying to think as a social media follower, and what would they like to see from you?
Okay, and this one's, I guess, a little bit of future gazing. It's asking, what do you see as the future channels of communication? So the example given here is, like 15 years ago. Well, those of us who are old enough were using Friends Reunited. Some people on here might not be using it, and Facebook didn't exist back then.
That's true.
Obviously since then we've got Instagram. My kids love Snapchat. So it's constantly changing. But what do you see as the I guess the emerging channels?
I think what's interesting, especially the last year on social media, is that there are more people who try to pay attention on privacy and how to be more safe, which is really great. So for example, WhatsApp is really growing, and it's owned by Facebook, and they do know that this is a great opportunity. And we do see that people prefer to have the safety and the encryption of the messages and the smaller audiences, rather than just shouting a general message. So again, that's where personalization comes in. So I think people are just shifting the perception of having one general message and just broadcasting something to every single person. and they try to narrow down to more niche platforms, like Snapchat, for example. It worked because it was targeting the audience that they knew it's going to work just for them.
Mm.
So if we start using Snapchat, we might not really understand how it works. It's not really engaging, but for someone who's 15, 16, they find it as the most engaging channel.
And question about the amount of content. So what is a sensible amount to post on each social network per week? So this this person is currently aiming for a post per day, but they're worried that might be too much. Some people are doing maybe 4 Facebook posts per day if they've got a lot to say, but are they risking putting people off if they're doing that much?
I think it really depends on the content you have available. If you're lucky enough to have lots of ideas and images and videos, then of course you can post even once a day. I wouldn't necessarily encourage on Facebook to post many things at once, because Facebook is having that algorithm that just keeps changing and makes things harder. And they don't really want you to post all the time if it's not really engaging, because it's like you're splitting the reach and the engagement into multiple posts.
Yes.
So it's better to focus on the quality. If you do have lots of posts, you can spread them throughout the week and try to see how it's going. If it's not really going well, you can try with another post later on. But if it is going quite well with engagement, you want to let it have its own time to actually develop.
I guess one of the things we've also seen to fair amount, mainly on Twitter actually, is people either sending the identical post or changing the title but having the same link in it.
It's funny, Twitter is so different from Facebook.
Yeah.
You can just post even the same message and not necessarily see that again. So you can't post on Twitter, for example, even 5, 10 times a day, but not everyone will see the same post. That's why everyone just keeps changing the content and keep posting that again.
Okay, well, we wrapped up all the questions. I think that's really interesting.
Great conversation.
Yeah, and it's been great to kind of explore around the topic more through the questions as well. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks so much for having me.
In terms of today's session, we will be putting the recording of it online within the next week. So do please feel free to share it with your colleagues, or if you want to dig back into it again, review that as well. Also, I mentioned at the outset, just like to re-mention our feedback form. Do please give us your feedback. We'd love to know what you thought of today's session and what sort of direction you'd like us to go in for future sessions as well. We've now got a break for a couple of weeks, but we will be back in June with further sessions. So if you'd like to keep informed of those, do please register online at tech-trust.org/2019 webinar series. So that's all I'd like to say today. Thank you very much for your time and look forward to speaking to you all again at a future point in the near future. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.